Alrighty. Well, welcome back, everybody. We are on the second episode of our new series, reading a creationist book. This is part 2. So we are reading a book that I was gifted, and I'm using that term loosely, a number of years ago, titled Did Man Get Here by Evolution or by Creation? And if you weren't here for the first episode, this book right here was written back in 1967. That's why all of its citations are so new for creationists. No, just kidding. And joining me is Peter. He is co-hosting as well as producing, a man of many hats. In fact, there he is wearing one right now.
I have my producer and my presenter hat on, so I'm all good.
Welcome, Peter. Welcome back. Glad to have you.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, so I did screw up in my tweet, so I have to apologize to everyone who's here because of the tweet, because I said 1968, so it's 1967.
What's a couple years between friends? At any rate. So hello everyone in the side chat. We got Artemis, Brain Sample, Brian Stevens, Vandalia. We got a couple people in here. Good. Fun times. All right. So in the first chapter of this book, which we looked at the week before last, because we finished up our natural history show with Dapper last week. So the week before last, we looked at chapter 1, in which the author or authors, I'm not sure, it doesn't really have authors, it's just put out by the Jehovah's Witnesses collectively. I guess the whole of them, like, all typed a sentence in the book. I don't know.
So would that mean that instead of authors, we would have witnesses? That's, yeah. I don't know.
I guess you could say that. Yeah, exactly. So they talked about how evolution is claimed to be a fact by all the leading biologists, but there are these staggering difficulties that they have in trying to understand anything about it, which was just all dishonest quote mining and equivocation. It was bad. And I'm sure this time around, though, on this second chapter, we are going to be greeted with, just nothing but the truth, Peter. I'm certain
the whole truth. So help me, Jehovah. I mean, I'm just
all right.
For people who haven't seen the first part, the things that are mentioned in this book are literally what we hear on a daily basis from creationists like Ken Ham, Kent Hovind, Mr. Banana Man. Nothing has changed. They haven't learned anything, apparently, since 1967. They haven't watched any of the new science that has pretty much progressed a little bit since 1967.
Just tiny bit.
Yeah. None of that. Everything in this book is still valid, which makes you wonder.
Yep.
It's like the Bible. It doesn't change. If it's true, it's true.
That's right, yeah. It's always going to be true. Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. So chapter 2 is the development of evolutionary theory. So we're talking about the history of biology, basically. So I'm sure we're going to be, we're in for a treat this time around, Peter.
Mm-hmm. Probably.
All right, here we go. Quote, although some ancient philosophers entertained what might be called evolutionary ideas, none of these gained any wide acceptance. Also, in the Middle Ages, zoological writings contained recipes reputed to produce such things as flies, bees, and even mice from non-living matter. But it was not until the last 2 centuries that the theory of organic evolution gained any real prominence. Among the first earlier theories to gain acceptance were those of the English naturalist Erasmus Darwin, grandfather of Charles Darwin, and French scientist Comte de Buffon in the 18th century. They maintained that when a plant or an animal acquired a new characteristic from its environment, it could pass this on to its offspring, resulting in changes that accounted for evolution. For example, they contended that the thick armor-like skin in some animals developed because they received repeated blows. This characteristic, they claimed, was then passed on to their offspring, which were born with thicker skin. In the early 19th century, French scientist Jean de Lamarck published a book agreeing with the theory of acquired characteristics, but said it was the needs of organisms that gave the driving force to evolution. According to his theory, giraffes got long necks because they ran out of vegetation and had to stretch their necks to obtain leaves higher up on trees. In this way, each generation passed on to its offspring a slightly longer neck. Close quote. Okay, not terrible for a start. He's right in saying that some ancient philosophers entertained what might be called evolutionary ideas. Was it Heraclitus, I think, had the idea that like everything was made of water or whatever, or everything was the essence of water. So it was always changing. And there was like Anaximander who believed that humans like lived in fish before they came to land. So yeah, none of these were like evolution in the modern sense, surely. And then there were some who recognized that like organisms could change over time, things like that, or populations could change over time. But again, no mechanism. No one really understood where variations came from, anything like that. So it wasn't evolution in any real sense, which is why it's always very silly to hear like Ken Ham and Bodhi Hodge say, "Oh, the ancient Greeks believed in evolution." No, they didn't. No, they didn't. Sorry, they did not. Then yeah, inheritance of acquired characteristics. Yeah, that's a decent overview of that. Any thoughts, Peter?
Well, so a few. When it boils down to what they knew, Darwin didn't exactly know how it happened. He figured out that there was a pattern, but how that exactly happened, we only figured that out when we learned about DNA and we learned about mutations. So yeah, and the other thing, which the Bodhi Hodge claiming that the Greek knew, I think that that is a little bit dishonest, because they have this thing that you're either this or a Greek, and the Greek then means that you're not a real Christian. So slipping that in there when you have a Greek philosopher who has thought about something that could look like evolution, obviously he needs to slip that in and say the Greeks believed, because that is a thing that is recurring in their videos. I'm not entirely sure what the whole deal behind the Greeks is, but
I mean, I guess because they were like, they were heathens, they were non-Christians, therefore they must be exactly like the atheists today, I guess is the argument. Not entirely sure.
famous for all their pottery with gay sex on it. So yeah, obviously they were doing it wrong. They were not of God.
Hey, it's Pride Month, so here we are.
See,
it all comes back around, Peter. It's all history is a flat circle.
Yes, like the Earth. I mean,
exactly. How widespread was the belief in acquired characteristics in those days? In his book, Charles Darwin, evolutionist Debunking answers, quote, "Nobody would have thought of doubting it till the close of the 19th century. The number of men before the 19th century who rejected the inheritance of acquired characteristics could be counted on the fingers of one hand," close quote. However, at the close of the 19th century, German scientist August Weismann tried to establish a breed of tailless mice by simply cutting off their tails before allowing them to mate. A 1966 textbook review text in biology tells of the results. Quote, he repeated this procedure for 20 successive generations. The last generation proved to have tails as long as those of their ancestors. This was the first experimental proof that acquired characteristics such as artificial taillessness are not inherited. Acquired characteristics are not inherited because environmental factors, which do not affect the genes in the sex cells, cannot influence the next generation. Close quote. Nobel Prize-winning geneticist H.J. Muller also said, quote, despite the strong influence of the environment in modifying the body as a whole, and even the protoplasm of its cells, the genes within the germ cells of that body retain their original structure without specific alterations caused by the modification of the body, so that when the modified individual reproduces, it transmits to its offspring genes unaffected by its own acquired characters. Close quote. So yeah, Weissman is the guy who's credited with the idea that you have like your somatic cells, which are your body cells, which are separate from your gametes, your sex cells. In fact, it's called the Weissman barrier. Your any acquired characteristics, like if you get cancer, like skin cancer, for instance, and you survive that, that's not going to be transmitted to your offspring, right? Your genes are, or your sorry, the genes in your gametes are unaffected by what's happening to your genes in other parts of the body. That's fair. That's fine. Interestingly, I'll say this. Lamarckism and I guess, Comte de Buffon and Erasmus Darwin, their idea of acquired characteristics or inheritance of acquired characteristics actually enjoyed quite a bit of celebrity in the 20th century. It didn't die in the 1800s, even though it should have, certainly. In fact, Darwin held on to some aspects of it, and he included it as a mechanism of evolution in origin. But in France, because Lamarck and Comte de Buffon were French, Lamarckism stayed around for quite a while. In fact, there was this whole thing called the eclipse of Darwinism in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where Lamarckism sort of rose to prominence again in France. And it wasn't until the 1920s and 30s when you had Ronald Fisher, Sewell Wright, and J.B.S. Haldane, who figured out population genetics and developed these statistical models that encompass that and encompass natural selection, which resulted ultimately in the neo-Darwinian synthesis, that finally Lamarckism was dead in academia. That was what ultimately killed it. But even then, even after that, Lamarckism still stuck around in Soviet Russia. The Russians had their own Lamarckism. We call it nowadays Lysenkoism, after Trofim Lysenko, who became the head of agriculture in Soviet Russia under Stalin. And because of Lysenko, because he claimed that the concept of the gene and the concept of natural selection and Darwinism, all of this was pro-capitalism, because there were like social Darwinism ideas, which were basically very, very hyper-capitalistic. He claimed these were bourgeoisie ideas. These are Western ideas. This is not good communist ideas. He's not a good communist idea. And so as a result, Lysenko had the farmers plant their crops close together, because the thinking was, one, that inheritance of acquired characteristics was true, but also that if you planted all your crops close together, they would develop a communist ideal and they would share their resources equally. Well, I think you can imagine about how well that went. Millions of people perished as a result. So not very well. And suffice it to say, nobody holds to Lamarckism today. So,
no, but I'm curious. Wasn't the and now we get to, what is it? Rule 34 of no, it's not Rule 34. That's entirely different. Sorry, my mind wandered off. No, but the Nazis also had their own form of evolution because they had Darwin. All of Darwin's books were banned and burned, but Hitler
Right.
did take to a specific guy, and I keep forgetting his name. Who?
Well, the Nazis were basically just practicing artificial selection en masse because they were like,
Mhm.
we want only blonde-haired, blue-eyed women to reproduce,
Yes.
and we would produce only offspring of these types. So basically, they were just doing like what we do for crops and cattle and chickens and things.
Yeah.
That's artificial selection. They were just doing that like writ large, basically with humans.
Yes.
So,
But so what I was saying, that Hitler had this guy, and I think he held to Lamarckism as well, and he was even
maybe.
a creationist. And I'll have to ask Arn Ra because he knows the guy. He's mentioned it in several videos.
Okay.
But yeah, and funny thing is because another thing you read out is that if an organism loses its tail during its lifetime, it's not going to pass that on. It's kind of weird because for a very long time it was argued that Eve was created from Adam's rib, and this is why men had one less rib.
Right.
Which isn't true.
Right.
By the way.
Of course not. Right. Men and women have equal number of ribs, but also
Yes.
you still every so often you see that little canard pop up, and it's the funniest thing.
Yeah. Well,
it's just so funny to see that.
What is even funnier is that when the Bible talks about that, it says that Eve was created after God took something out of Adam's side. Now, if you look throughout the Bible, whenever it is called the side, it is talking about the genitals. And so,
right,
while Eve may have been created from a bone, apparently there are no humans with a baculum. Makes you think.
Right, yeah,
And
I think I've heard that. It was like
I have to thank Alicia Ben Abuya on Twitter for this because he came up with this idea, I think, a couple of years ago. And I still find it funny, and I have used it in arguments with Christians. They don't seem to like it.
Hive Science said epigenetics sort of vindicated Lamarckism, though. No, it didn't. No. No. Bad. SWAT. Epigenetics did not vindicate Lamarckism or Lamarck. Because epigenetics still has to be selected, right? It's still natural selection. If your epigenetic modification, which I guess we'll tangent for a moment here. So epigenetics, despite what that absolute abject moron Frank Turek says, epigenetics is changing the way in which genes are regulated, basically, without changing the genetic sequence. So what you do is you can add certain types of molecules to DNA, like you can add a methyl group or an acetyl group or something like that, and you change the way that the gene is read by the transcription enzymes, basically. And so, for reference, Frank Turek says that epigenetics is the structure of the cell. And can someone like hit him with a genetics textbook, please? No, okay, fine. I'm not advocating violence. Gently tap him on the head with it. Gently tap him. But regardless, it's not inheritance of acquired characteristics per se. You are still it is still under natural selection. If you do have some change which is transmitted to the next generation, it still is under natural selection. And of course, it's a gene which is responsible for methylating a particular region of DNA. So I really don't like saying, or don't like hearing people say that Lamarck is vindicated, because he really wasn't. I don't think there's anything in biology today that's near enough to what he thought that we could say he was vindicated. It's just simply too far away.
Well, I do have to point out, I don't know if you...
That's my thought.
If you know this, but so high science is the lovable creature formerly known as brain bug. So.
Right. Yes. Yes, yes.
They said I got to trigger Jackson.
They didn't have genetics in Lamarck's day, but they did have ecological triggers. They're saying DNA didn't vindicate Darwin. I don't follow the logic of that. Darwin's idea of variations was wrong. Like, he had no idea how variations were passed. He thought it was, what was it, pangenesis, which was just totally bonkers wrong. So, I mean, I guess it depends. So, anyway. Okay, back to this. Quote, although true scientific facts exploded completely, the evolutionary theory of acquired characteristics, it did not die out completely. Oh, look at that. The 1960 book, The Mechanism of Evolution by W.H. Dowdeswell, relates, quote, the last of the Lamarckist revivals took place in Russia in 1948 under the leadership of Lysenko, but the claims of his school are now discredited and appear to have been actively activated largely by ideological rather than scientific motives, close quote. Later, Time magazine of February 12, 1965 reported that Lysenko was removed from his position and his theories rejected even by the communists, noting that heredity is controlled by genes in the reproductive cells and remains unchanged throughout an individual's life. The greatest impetus for evolution came with the writings of Charles Darwin, particularly in 1859 with the publishing of his book, The Origin of Species. Darwin's theory was that members of different species competed with one another for life, and that in such struggle, any advantageous variation would enable its possessor to gain the upper hand. The fittest, therefore, would survive. The others would perish. The survivors would pass on the beneficial variations to their offspring, accounting eventually for the evolution of new forms of life. Darwin called this process natural selection. Close quote. Okay, so like we already said, the Lysenkoists were practicing Lamarckism, so well and good. We talked about that already. Members of different species, as well as our own, competed with one another for life, and that in such struggle, any advantageous variation would enable its possessor to gain the upper hand. The fittest, therefore, would survive. The others would perish. The survivor would pass on the beneficial variations to their offspring, accounting eventually for the evolution of new forms of life. Yeah, I mean, that's... The
only objection, that was every single time that comes up, the fittest, I have to object.
I wouldn't say the fittest.
Yeah, it's not the fittest. It's those who are best adapted to their environment. And that has nothing to do with fitness.
I mean, not fitness in the sense we traditionally think about it, right? Like getting strong or getting fast or something like that. It's fitness in the sense of what is the fitness of a gene? Like, how many offspring will you have with this allele relative to another allele for the same gene? That sort of fitness.
Yeah, but the reason I object to this is because whenever this comes up, when you're talking to a creationist, it will say, see, this is where Darwin just proposed that survival of the fittest. So if you're stronger than anyone else, then you're going to survive. It's not what that means. And they will always use that in a way to get to social Darwinism. And then we're back at the Nazis again because they were the fittest. And so, see, this is, and I have to just object every single time that term comes up. Because if, let's say you have a fish who lives in a cave somewhere, it's going to grow skin over its eyes to protect the eyes because they're no longer needed. that doesn't make the fish fitter. It makes it better adapted because now it can't hurt its eyes anymore. So it is not only gaining something instead of losing something, but it's adapting to its environment. So it is fitter in that environment. It's not fitter in the way we look at the word being fit.
Well,
if that makes
yes,
even
it's
any sense.
fitness in the evolutionary sense, not fitness in an athletic sense.
Exactly.
Because those are different terms. Fitness in the evolutionary sense refers to your number of offspring. How many individuals, how many offspring do you have that you are able to pass this allele onto, and that will determine whether or not it's looked at as beneficial or neutral or harmful. So yeah, I mean, other than that, though, I think that's a relatively decent overview of natural selection, or definition, I guess. I think that's fine. Okay, we might illustrate Darwin's belief with the giraffe. For an unknown reason, some giraffes were born with slightly longer necks than others. The ones with longer necks won the competition for food, therefore survived natural selection, and passed on a slightly longer neck to their offspring. This was repeated for many generations, thus supposedly accounting for long-necked giraffes. As time passed, however, objections to Darwin's position appeared. This is called to our attention in the 1964 textbook Biology for Today by Clark and Mould. Quote, scientists have raised a number of objections against complete acceptance of Darwin's theory. 1. The theory does not account for all the known facts of heredity. For example, the theory does not clearly explain why some variations are inherited and others not. We'll get to that. Many variations are so trivial that they could not possibly aid an organism in its struggle for existence. 2. The theory does not explain how the gradual accumulation of trivial mutations could result in the appearance of some more complex structures found in higher organisms, close quote. In the book, Story of Life, evolutionist H. Mellersh notes, quote, on the Darwinian theory, the questioner may point out any variation has to be of immediate value to its possessor if it is going to give him a better chance of survival than his fellows. Of what survival value is the first dim beginnings of an eye, or forelimbs starting to flap about feebly, or nakedly in anticipation of a wing. Natural selection is so mindless, it is so purposeless. Oh, good Lord, we have a lot to dig in here. I'm gonna take a drink first.
There's a lot to unpack in that particular part.
Oh yeah, there's a lot. Okay, so funny enough, actually, I don't know how many of you follow Science Magazine, but they release regularly their new articles, like a new spate of articles. And one of them today was actually about the evolution of the giraffe. There was a new giraffe fossil that was found. It was called like Discocarex or something like that. And it was apparently very groovy. No, just kidding. Discocarex had like this dome on its head, which was apparently used for battling with rival males. So the thinking is, or at least according to this paper, that giraffes, in part, their neck grew because of sexual selection. So females valued males whose necks were longer on average. So, so first of all, let's unpack all of that. Well, let's see. So his bit about giraffes was fine. He says in his objections, the theory does not account for all the known facts of heredity. I'm honestly not sure how anyone could raise that as an objection, but all right. For example, the theory does not clearly explain why some variations are inherited and others not. Okay, so I don't understand how he could cite that when he literally said on the same page, In such struggle, any advantageous variation would enable its possessor to gain the upper hand. The fittest, therefore, would survive, the others would perish. He
Yeah.
said that literally on the
Yes.
same page. So how does he say 2 paragraphs later, I have no idea how or why some variations persist and some don't? Like, what are you talking about? You just said how.
You just gave an example.
Right, exactly. The thing about the giraffes, so the reason that Darwin and Lamarck's explanations for how the giraffe got its long neck differ is, as we saw earlier, Lamarck thought that giraffes basically stretched their neck up every generation, and so their neck got a little bit longer and a little bit longer and a little bit longer. Darwin sort of flipped this on its head, pun intended. His idea was every organism is born with mostly minor variations. Now, some of these minor variations are immediately useful to your survival and reproduction. Some of them are harmful, and most of them don't have any effect on you at all. They're called neutral variations. So the ones which are useful to your survival, so maybe you have a mutation which makes you better at surviving, like malaria, for instance, or some virus or bacteria or protist or whatever. Well, an allele that promotes, like a better immune system is going to be favored over any allele that does not do that. You are more likely, by virtue of having that allele, to survive and have offspring than anyone who doesn't have it.
Mm-hmm.
That's not that hard to grasp, right?
No.
And so I don't understand how he can say this isn't accounted for by evolution. That's literally what natural selection is, like definitionally. The definition of natural selection is differential survival and reproduction. That's literally the definition of natural selection. So I don't know how you can say that. Many variations are so trivial that they could not possibly aid an organism in its survival for existence. Yeah. So this thing called neutral theory, well, these guys were writing in the 1960s, but even before then, researchers were saying that most variations were neutral. Even Darwin said this. He said most variations were probably neutral. They probably didn't help one way or the other. And we know that's true. We have mathematical models for that now, that the vast majority of mutations don't have much of an effect. So again, that's perfectly fine. That's covered very well under evolution. There's no question there. The theory does not explain how the gradual accumulation of trivial variations could result in the appearance of some more complex structures. Yeah, it does, actually. Dapper and I talk about a whole bunch of them in both the Process of Evolution series and our Natural History series. And I've done lots of videos in my biodiversity series, for instance, where we talk about the gradual evolution of different groups of organisms. So yeah, evolution really does account for all those things. Any variation has to be of immediate value to its possessor.
No, because
I mean,
he just gave the
I'm
example
not sure what is meant
with
by that.
he gave the example with the giraffe. That's not
Right.
immediately going from a short neck to a long neck. This is a period of time
Right.
in which this gradually happens. So,
Right.
yes, gradual changes can still be beneficial and be passed on. So,
Right.
again, talking against something he just explained, mentioned.
Right. I mean, and as for giraffes, like we have, I don't know what the fossil record of giraffes like was in the 60s, probably not as good as we have today, but we have the whole series basically from like having very short like neck vertebrae or was it cervical vertebrae, and then they get longer and longer and longer and longer, and we can see that over geologic history, right? We have like Giraffocarax and what else do we have? And like Bergerbolinia and Sametherium and all these different giraffes. We have this huge lineup of giraffe fossils where we can see how like the neck has elongated over millions of years. So clearly it's not just a matter of like you just have short necks and then you have long necks. No, we have all these intermediate stages where we are beautifully documenting that process. So each generation has these trivial differences, right? The neck isn't like super longer than the next. It may be like, a few centimeters longer, maybe a few inches longer, what have you. But it's not a lot longer. But over generations, these small incremental differences are adding up bit by bit by bit until you get a neck which is substantially longer than the original was.
And if you want to go, if you want to go by just small increments, Darwin's fringes, where he noticed the differences in the beaks, those are very small differences. But for the bird, it's a big thing in order to survive because based on the food. So I still don't get it, because this is something that he should have known already. Talking about Darwin, yeah, I was going to say he should have read Darwin's books, but we know enough to know that they probably read quotes on
right
in another, back in those days, back in 1967, probably in a creationist book, read those quotes
probably
because they didn't
they
didn't have websites yet, so
they probably read a lot of like George McCready Price and things like that. Yeah, I mean, I am curious. I'm just like flipping through their references right now. And I mean, they cite what looks like a lot of different like textbooks and research articles that look fine, and they cite like books by actual scientists, and at the same time they completely lie about evolution. So
well, but Kent Hovind does the exact same thing. He will cite from textbooks, and he will cite from sometimes even from papers, but he will only cite that specific snippet that will look like it is in favor of his position, which is a dishonest thing. All these people seem to do. Otangelo is one of the best I can name who does that. He will just go look for one sentence and then completely discard the entire paper. And he will also only look at the abstract, not at the paper. Because if you ask him to mention anything that is mentioned in the conclusion, he never can do that. Even though he cites the links to the papers. And has so, and this is what they do. They will just look at the famous quote from Darwin's Eye, where Darwin starts out saying, "Well, I this is ridiculous," and then starts over several pages explaining how the eye could have evolved. They will just cut it off right there. This suits our narrative. This is what we're going to take out of it. So, yeah, even though they have good citations, it's not always the fact that they read the entire thing they're citing. It's probably where they got their quotes from. Their quote mines.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you're right. I will probably come back to that quote. Yes, they do. Okay. So I think actually in the next chapter, we'll talk about they even cite it. I just accidentally happened to open to the exact page. So yeah, We'll discuss that quote in detail in the next episode. That'll be fun. I guess just sort of briefly, they mentioned like the old what good is of what survival value is the first dim beginnings of an eye. There's a lot. Like there are photoreceptive proteins, basically. So you change how the protein folds. You change its conformation when it gets hit by photons, right? So what this does is there are different species of bacteria, and they basically have their metabolism set up where they only do certain processes during the day, right? So as long as there's sunlight hitting them, it's changing the conformation of this protein, which is telling them to do whatever metabolism it is, some form of photosynthesis, what have you. But then when the sun goes away, then that protein changes back to its other conformation, and they're no longer doing that metabolism. Now, that's an energy-saving mechanism, because if you're still trying to do this and you need sunlight, and you're not getting sunlight, you're expending energy trying to do this process and failing. So that's an energy-saving measure right there. And these bacteria can't see. They don't have eyes. They have no way to... They don't even care which direction the light's coming from. They just know, oh, there's sunlight hitting me. I need to do this process. And so, go slightly up from that. You get you get like phototaxis. So basically you have protists. Sorry, Dapper. If you rewatch this, I said protist. You get unicellular eukaryotes, who swim in the direction of light. So they have these little like pigment granules all over their self, and whichever direction the light hits them, they know, hey, swim towards the light, go that way, because that's where food is or whatever. And so again, they can't really see. They're not seeing images like you or I can with glasses on, cough, cough. But they still know to travel in the direction of light. So, and then of course, just go up from there. The eye at any stage is extremely useful. I've never understood this argument. And it's the same with the wing. Like, gliding works. It's a thing lots of animals do. So I just don't understand that argument.
And even before that, I mean, so I think that it's now common consensus that the wing developed as a mechanism to keep a bigger clutch of eggs warm. If you have that wing that can cover the eggs and can keep the temperature more constant, that's beneficial. And if you then already have those, let's say half a wing, and you run and you are able to make bigger leaps because of your wing, that leads to gliding. Gliding leads to flying. Yeah, it all works. It all works.
Whoa, it all works.
It's something that and this is how they can stick to something. Has to either be 100% functional or it's useless. For people who haven't seen it, yesterday there was a very frustrating stream on Dr. Dan Cardinal's channel where a guy kept saying that, they were basically talking about when about Tiktaalik, when fish moved to the land. Dr. Dan was explaining, okay, so now you got people, you got organisms competing for food in the sea, and there's one organism that is able to crawl on land. So there it has to compete with no one, because it's the only one that just crawled out of the sea trying to get some food on land. So here is where his basic legs are beneficial. And the guy kept saying, yeah, but he's going to lose out to all the other fish in the sea. Yeah, well, duh. He's got a new food source. He doesn't need to compete with those. And I
Right.
don't. Dr. Dan had to explain this to him several times, and it still didn't sink in. And this is
Yeah.
it's frustrating how you will be able to explain it so even a 5-year-old, hey Kent Hovind, a 5-year-old can actually understand it, and yet you've got adults and you can keep explaining it and it just doesn't work. I don't get it.
Yeah, it's like you have a niche which is ever so slightly different from everyone else. If you think about it, ignore the ecology for a second. Ignore that. Think about it just in terms of like jobs. Just think about the economy for a second. If you want to go into the grocery business, you have to compete with a lot of stores. If you want to start your own, let's say you're new, you just come to the city and you want to start up your own grocery store, but you're looking around, you're like, huh, well, if I wanted to start a grocery store, I'd have to compete with Walmart and Brookshire's and Target and Piggly Wiggly and whoever else. A whole bunch of different stores who all, are in the same, not the exact same niche, but they're all in similar niches. They occupy the grocery store niche. So what you do is you recognize that you can't also occupy the grocery store niche. You can't do it. You're going to go out of business. Everyone already knows all the other stores and they'll just pass you right by. So what you need to do is focus on one thing in particular. Let's say you decide to sell just bread, right? So you become like a bakery. So you don't sell all the groceries, you just sell one particular type of groceries, but you sell that one particular type very, very well. You are selling bread better than all the grocery stores can because your selection is better and your quality is better because you can afford to spend all your money on quality rather than quantity. So people may come to you for bread, but they're going to the other stores for all their other stuff. If you think about that, that's basically how the concept of a niche works.
Mm-hmm.
The other grocery stores are what are called generalists. They have a generalized niche. They do a whole bunch of stuff. Whereas you, the bread maker, are a specialist. You do one particular job, but you do it a lot better than the others do any particular jobs. And that's what happens in evolution. So if you have these species, and if they compete with each other, these two different species, one of them will specialize on eating one particular food source. But it does that so well that it no longer has to compete with the other species. The other species can't eat this other food source as well as the first species can, so it goes and eats other sources of food. They are no longer competing with each other. They're eating different food sources.
Mm-hmm.
And they're doing different things in the environment. Maybe one digs for its food where the other, scampers up trees or grazes in the field or what have you. But that's how natural selection works. You have niche differentiation, which is a way to reduce competition. It
Yeah.
works in the environment and it works in economics.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. And this is why I don't get it that if you talk to a creationist, this just doesn't sink in. They keep going
Right.
back, well, it has to be good at both the new thing and the old thing. And this is not how that works.
Right.
So,
You know what, Hive Science? I was just making a point. Fight me. He yes. She points out at Hive Science that generalists survive extinctions more effectively. That's true. Typically, generalists like your coelacanths, your horseshoe crabs, guys like that, who eat a wide variety of foods and they don't do anything super special, they are more likely to survive when extinctions roll around than specialists are. Because if you're a specialist and you eat only one type of food and an extinction happens and kills off your one type of food, well, you're screwed. It's over. That's it. But if you're a generalist, you go, oh, well, I won't eat that food anymore. I'll just eat this other one. So it's fine.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay. Let's continue. Hence, or quote, hence, Darwin's theory as he presented it was proved faulty and many aspects of it were rejected. The next major step in evolution. Well, how could there be a next major step if the first one was faulty? Anyways, I'm sorry. In evolution came in 1901. Dutch botanist Hugo de Vries had been experimenting with plants known as evening primroses. He noticed that occasionally some appeared with unusual structures and that their offspring inherited these same traits. He called these mutants. De Vries believed that favorable large mutations accounted for evolution. For example, giraffes with unusually long necks, or mutants, appeared and survived better than did short-necked giraffes. These mutants produced offspring with long necks, supposedly accounting for this bit of evolution. This new theory did not remain unchallenged for long, or like at all. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself again. Difficulties soon became apparent. Concerning the sudden large changes that De Vries claimed were responsible for evolution, De Beer comments, quote, many of them had lethal results and killed the organisms that carried them, far from conferring improvement in adaptation. The mutations seemed to be pathological and provided no explanation of how adaptations arose and became perfected. The result was that during the first 20 years of the 20th century, evolutionary studies and theories were in a state of chaos and confusion. Well, we'll talk about that in a second. That'll be interesting. Close quote. Summarizing, the principal theories of evolution noted so far, Hall and Lesser's 1966 review text in Biology states, quote, since Lamarck's theory acquired characteristics has been proved false, it is only of historical interest. Darwin's theory, natural selection, does not satisfactorily explain the origin and inheritance of variations. De Vries' theory, large mutations, has been shown to be weak because no single mutation or set of mutations has ever been so large and numerous that it has been known to start a new species in one generation of offspring, close quote. Has this chaos of theories been cleared up in our day? What is the current theory accepted by most evolutionists? Has it proved more plausible? Is it more scientific? Okay, again, a whole lot to unpack there. Oh my gosh. First of all, the De Vries idea. Yes, De Vries was like one of the first guys to champion this, which is called macromutationism or saltationism, basically evolution occurring in jumps. Or as Darwin said, natura non facet saltum, which means evolution or nature does not make leaps. Well, so De Vries, who was actually one of the guys who rediscovered Mendelism, interestingly, who discovered Mendel's work, and later, more famously, I think nowadays, was Richard Goldschmidt. But they both sort of pioneered this idea that big mutations conferred adaptive advantages. Now, despite what the author says here, this idea really was never taken very seriously. The early experiments in genetics, the really big ones, were done by Thomas Hunt Morgan and his colleagues back in the right around the start of the 1900s, 19-aughts, 19 teens, that area. And they didn't really support this. Their idea seemed to be more that mutations were typically small, variations were typically small. And then when Ronald Fisher and Haldane and Wright came around later, they also really harped on the idea that mutations were typically small and that evolution proceeded through gradual changes accumulating over generations. In fact, that was built into their mathematical models of natural selection because, as they pointed out, most or many of these mutations were lethal. Indeed. There's a book by Richard Dawkins titled Climbing Mount Improbable, It's a really good book. Highly recommend. But the Mount Improbable, if you think about it, it's having two different like faces. Basically, you have the very steep face, where you start at the bottom and jump all the way up to the top. Now that's highly improbable. It's far more likely that whatever mutation you have, which you would attempts to do that, will just kill you outright. You'll have some developmental problem. You just won't make it. But the other side of the mountain, the other face, is this gently sloping, gentle slope, right? You very slowly go up. Well, that's really more of what mutations do. It's a gentle slope. Now, there are jumps and starts. And in fact, this review text in biology says large mutations, DeVries theory has been shown to be weak because no single mutation or set of mutations has ever been so large and numerous that it has been known to start a new species in one generation. Actually, that's not true. We actually know quite a few instances of that nowadays. There's a whole thing which, again, at this time, they probably didn't know about because genetic testing wouldn't be known for a number of years at this point, at least a decade. Mm-hmm. And it's called polyploidy. So basically, you can increase your number of chromosomes. So let's say you start with 2 chromosomes. You start with a pair. So you use 2 full sets of chromosomes, basically. One inherited from your mother, one inherited from your father. And then in one of the offspring, instead of having just 2 pairs, one of those pairs gets copied. So now they have 3 pairs.
Mm-hmm.
Or 3 sets. I keep saying pairs. I meant sets. You have 3 sets of chromosomes. So now you can't. Now, if you're a plant, for instance, you can't reproduce with the parental generation. So instead, you now have to do what's called selfing. So you basically pollinate yourself, and then you have offspring, and you get started. So you go off asexually. So you do have a new species, which appears via this gene or this whole genome duplication event, basically, which also happened. Well, I said polyploidy, or I said diploidy to triploidy, so not whole genome, but you can have whole genome duplications, which happens like the marbled crawfish, which duplicated its whole genome in the 1990s, and now there's a new species called Procambarus virginalis, which also reproduces asexually. So it turns out, yes, you can have very large mutations resulting in new species. That's not the rule. That's the exception, though.
Famously, when it comes to polyploidy, it's and I forgot in which debate it was because there are so many. This was a question that was asked of Kent Hovind if he had heard of polyploidy, because again he said that you couldn't have those changes, and then someone said, "Well, have you heard of the strawberry?" And then they explained, so there is polyploidy. And his response was, but it is still a strawberry. No, it is a strawberry because it's polyploid. That's what you're eating.
Right.
Again.
Right.
They will just skip over it.
Yeah, when I had a conversation, he mentioned polyploidy, but he was like, "Oh, well, they're all the strawberries are sterile." It's like, they're sterile because we don't want them like outcrossing. That's for cultivation purposes. But polyploidy does not cause sterility in nature, and this is well known to botanists. You also get like hybridization, which results in like different numbers of chromosomes in the offspring, and then they like do selfing, and that causes a new population to arise. But yeah, polyploidy happens. Like the marbled crawfish, that's one example. Lots and lots of plants do polyploidy very easily. It's one of the major ways that plants like evolve, or speciate, I should say. So, So the whole idea of like macromutationism, while not in its original form today, it still has a place. It's not totally out the window. But also, I wanted to point out, he says, so the author says the result, ... was that during the first 20 years of the 20th century, evolutionary studies and theories were in a state of chaos and confusion. Now, he's cut out something and pasted another sentence there, making it seem like it's actually just one sentence. But that is clearly not the case, right? Macromutationism was never like the leading theory for evolutionary change. Never. It was never the leading theory. It was proposed by a couple different people at different times as like, hey, maybe this also happens. But it was never, this is the way it happens. And so, again, same with like the other things. I have no way to like check this basically, but I'm just calling bogus. There's an ellipsis here, which I guarantee if we saw the full sentence, it doesn't say what the author wants it to say. I'll say that.
It's usually the case.
Anything you'd like to add?
Well, it is something that they want to bring up because this is one of the arguments against evolution. A dog will always produce a dog. A dog will never produce a non-dog, right, which is what they think evolution should say. And it doesn't.
Right.
And yet they're still this dishonest that you can't get a new species from an older species. And in the meantime, Kent Hovind famously does, before he gets to his dog will never give birth to a non-dog, he will tell you that dogs came from wolves. So apparently, somewhere along the line, there was this wolf that gave birth to a non-wolf, which was a dog, according to his line of thinking. Skip that completely, because it can happen, but then it can't happen. It's blatant dishonesty also, when it comes to that.
$4.99 from Vandalia says, Jackson, next time instead of reading a creationist book, can you read something smarter like Green Eggs and Ham? A good idea.
Well, and here I disagree, because by reading a book like this, you can point creationists to this specific series and say, okay, you think you've got a new argument? Go have a look. That argument has been around since 1967, and most likely because there are a lot of people who got this book. You weren't a Jehovah's Witness. You were gifted the book. So the book has made its rounds through all kinds of denominations, which is probably why they're still harping on the same arguments that they did in 1967, because that's where it came from. That's when those arguments were already formed. I'm not saying necessarily only in this book, but they're that old. It's time to come up with something new.
Right.
It's been debunked.
Right.
We're debunking it again.
Andrew Cumming points out macromutations are probably still relevant, but as opposed to what some authors proposed, single mutations usually don't create entirely new organs or species. Exactly right. Right. Exactly. That's a good way to summarize that. All right. Quote, in recent years, recent for them. Yeah. In recent years, a new theory has been advanced, one that many evolutionists accept. The modern theory includes some of the views of Darwin and De Vries. Professor C.P. Martin of McGill University defines it by observing an American scientist, quote, an overwhelming majority of biologists believe that evolution proceeds by mutations and natural selection. The modern theory says that a beneficial small mutation appeared in a particular organism. That mutation made its possessor better suited to survive than were its competitors. The beneficial small mutation was passed along by heredity through many generations. Over a period of millions of years, other beneficial mutations continued to appear in the same line, causing the organism to change into a different one. Summing up the modern theory, the Oklahoma City Times of August 10th, 1966 said, quote, accidental alterations in the mechanism of this heredity slowly, by trial and error, made man better adapted to his environment than are his rivals. That's the accepted scientific view today, and scientists call this long, frequently bungling process evolution, close quote. Also, since the modern theory includes part of Darwin's belief in natural selection, it is often referred to as neo-Darwinism. I don't like that they keep referring to natural selection as Darwin's belief. Not a fan of that.
There's a reason for that as well. If you can get both positions on the exact same level, where it's a belief system, then you can say my belief is more true than yours, which is basically what religions have been doing since their inception, which is why you have different denominations. It's easier to cut down another denomination because it's only a belief system, and you're wrong. If you do the exact same thing with science, which you can demonstrate, pretty much everything you learn from science you can demonstrate, that's not a belief system. And that is where they have to just say it's a belief system. Another thing that is inherently dishonest, and one of the things that I hate about pure earth creationism. But carry on.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's not this wasn't a terrible overview of neo-Darwinism. Basically, neo-Darwinism just states that you have like Mendelian, these discrete Mendelian traits which arise, stochastically in organisms, and they're acted upon by natural selection over generations, leading to speciation. That's basically what neo-Darwinism says. Nothing crazy, nothing wild. And so neo-Darwinism was sort of formalized in the 40s, or well, really 30s and into the 40s. It was building off of Darwin's natural selection, as well as like Thomas Hunt Morgan and Dobzhansky, their work on like fruit flies with genetics, and so figuring out like how mutations arise and spread throughout populations. And then you have the mathematical work by the population geneticists, and those kind of all coalesced into one, and that was neo-Darwinism. And that's kind of the cool thing about evolutionary biology, at least in my opinion, is evolutionary biology is like a mix of a whole bunch of different fields. So it's not just genetics. It's genetics plus embryology and ecology and paleontology. It's all these different fields together, right? And I think that's really cool because you learn so much. You get to see how all of these things are interconnected, like how on the molecular scale DNA is changed, which results in a slightly different protein. Then that protein has a slightly different function, which slightly impacts an organism, which is part of a population, which is in an environment. And so the cool thing about evolution is you get to see how this microscopic scale change impacts things all the way up, throughout the biosphere. That's awesome. And I love that that's a thing. I love that we get to be a part of that, of understanding that process. It's really cool.
And just not only that, but what you mentioned is the different fields of science all converging on this being the case. It doesn't matter where you look. If you go to genetics, if you go to the fossil record, if you go to observations, you will see that there is change over time in a population. It's confirmed through so many different fields of science that at this point we can say it's fact. There might be shifting in details in how things happened, and maybe over time we'll get in more evidence because the fossil record keeps changing as well. what is in a clade at the moment, it can change next week if new fossils come in and we find out, hey, we got this wrong. This particular species doesn't need to be there. It needs to be in this clade because it fits in there better. It's a moving thing.
Right.
What won't change anymore is that we have change in a population over time, which is what evolution is.
Right.
It's just the details that are up for grabs and will be as long as new evidence comes in. And that is the good thing of science. It's not only confirming through different lines of evidence, but it's also self-correcting if it gets it wrong. Something creationism doesn't seem to do. Or we wouldn't be reading arguments in the book from 1967, which are the exact same arguments that are used today.
Andrew Cumming asks, are you taking random questions at all? I guess you can put it in there and I'll maybe answer it. But predominantly we're just reading the book. So, all right, continuing on. To illustrate the modern theory, we might again. Oh, sorry, I should have said. Technically, the neo-Darwinism, the neo-Darwinian theory, is also called the modern theory, which is a little ironic considering that it was modern in the 1930s. It's not so modern anymore. Anyway, to illustrate the modern theory, we might again refer to the giraffe. In past ages, the ancestors of modern giraffes were said to have short necks. As they struggled for existence, the giraffes competed for leaves on trees. Some giraffes happened to be mutants that had slightly longer necks. These survived in greater numbers as they could eat leaves higher up on trees. The short-necked giraffes died out, and those with the longer necks were left to produce offspring. These supposedly continued the process until the giraffe's neck reached its present height. Many evolutionists claim that finally a theory has been devised that adequately explains things. As the world-famous biologist and evolutionist John Rostand, I've never heard of him, stated, quote, for them, then, the problem of evolution has been thoroughly completed and definitely resolved. With mutation and natural selection, the perfect explanation is at our disposal, close quote. So, okay, first, before we get to the actual statements, I want to point out there's a picture here of a giraffe and a lamb standing next to each other there. Everyone see that? Mm-hmm. And the caption for that picture is, can there live side by side two cousins, each of them fitter than the other, one because its neck is longer, the other because its neck is shorter? And the answer, friends, is yes, you absolute nincompoops. They don't compete for the same resource.
No. Fun fact.
Jesus Christ.
Fun fact, we do have goats that climb trees.
I mean, yes, but they're not, they're famously not competing with giraffes for leaves on like acacia trees.
No.
Good gravy. This is the thing we were talking about with niche. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Go ahead. I can wait.
I was just going to say, this is the thing we were talking about earlier with niche differentiation. Like, the giraffe and the lamb have different niches. They're obviously not competing for the same food source. Like, good Lord. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, what I wanted to point out is what you said. You laughed. The world famous evolutionist, and then a name no one has ever heard of. And if you watch...
let's look him up.
If you watch Creation Ministries International at all, which is a Canadian-based organization, which is actually the one that Answers in Genesis evolved from after some shenanigans in which Ken Ham put things in his name that weren't really his. Never mind. But they will refer to a certain evolutionary biologist as a blogger, the blogger and YouTuber PZ Myers. Not even kidding. They still do this after all this time. They will just call him a blogger. And why?
Right.
Because they can't mention that he has a PhD. They can't mention that he teaches at a university because that would give him far too much credibility for them to be comfortable with. So they reduce him to a blogger and a YouTuber, which I think is hilarious. And this is probably why they put this guy up as a world famous biologist no one ever heard of.
Okay, so I just looked him up. He's apparently a French philosopher with a rockin' mustache. Yeah, it was a French biologist and philosopher who is known as a science writer who worked in amphibian embryology, parthenogenesis, and teratogeny. Cool. Now I've heard of him.
Mm-hmm.
What a world.
And now he's on your channel, so now he's going to be world famous because people from all over people from all over the world watch your videos. So now he's legitimately world famous.
I guess. Andrew Cumming asks a good question. What are your brief thoughts on ERVs and common descent and creation, a strange attempt to discard the argument based on their functionality? So actually, funny enough, I had to write for my virology class an essay, and I chose to write it on how ERVs demonstrate common descent. And so the principal point about why ERVs and not just ERVs, but other unique inserts throughout our genome and different genes and things, it's not whether or not they're functional. They could all be 100% functional. That's not the argument. And that's why creationists hyperfixate on it. Because they're like, oh, the evolutionist said it's all junk DNA. No, we didn't. No, first of all, we didn't. Second of all, even if it were all junk DNA or it were all functional, either way, that's not the argument. The argument is that ERVs are unique inserts in specific locations. So the same ERV is in the same gene in humans and chimps. And not just one, but thousands of them. We share thousands of ERVs in the exact same locations with chimps and with gorillas and orangutans, and in fact with all mammals. And I wrote a paper for my my virology class where I did discuss this at length. Like, it works at all levels, basically. We have ERVs for all humans. We have recent ERVs in some human populations. So yeah, it's if we didn't like figure out common ancestry before ERVs became a thing, ERVs would have clinched the deal on their own. Like, that's it. All it takes is ERVs. It's kind of amazing. Okay, anyway.
And still they will say it could be a common designer. Why would a common designer place ERVs in the exact same location in different species if they're not related? To trick us in thinking that they're related? Why would he put ERVs in there at all?
Right. And the thing about that's the other thing. ERVs have a very specific structure. They basically have a set of genes. So you have the two ends are what are called long terminal repeats. And then you have at least 3 genes. Some of them have more genes, some of them have fewer genes. But the point is you have these 3 genes, which are called GAG, PUL, and ENV. And they're different proteins that are involved in like cutting out and splicing the ERV DNA into our genome. And so only viruses have those genes. Why would we have those in our genome unless it came from a virus? Exactly. And you want to know what's even funnier? Peter?
Mm-hmm.
There are relatives of ERVs which are around today which infect people and we can see them infect us, or infect, different humans. And so we can witness those same sequences getting put into people's genomes. That's a thing we can do.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, it's not just we're kind of extrapolating into the past based on what we see. No, we're literally watching it happen and saying, oh, look, it's the same thing. Anyway.
They will have an escape out of this because they will say, how do you know that the present is how it always used to be? It's how they get out of dating methods. It's how they get out of everything, because apparently things in the past were different, so it must have happened differently. It's really dishonest, but they will have their way out of just brushing it off and saying, well, you can say that, but you can't prove that. Well, apparently you can.
God just did it that way because he wanted to, obviously.
Yeah.
Anyway. Quote, at this point, though, we are confronted with the same amazing dilemma noted earlier. Because the modern theory has not at all settled the matter, the controversy still rages. Information such as the following in Science Digest of January 1961 shows this. In an article titled, Should We Burn Darwin? I have several issues with that title, but we're going to skate past that.
Me too.
The writer states, notably because he's been dead for 80 years at that point, but regardless. Anyway, he's, quote, perhaps the most significant single fact in last year's development of French scientific thought is that the above orthodox explanation of evolution has been badly shaken. Often criticized in the past, it has now come under such heavy fire that the way seems to be open, in France at least, to a new theory of the origin of species. These are a few of the embarrassing questions asked today by the French rebels. If the giraffe with its 8-foot neck is the product of natural selection and an example of the survival of the fittest, what about the sheep with its neck no longer than a few inches? Aren't giraffes and sheep very close cousins, almost brethren in the animal kingdom? But then can there live side by side two cousins, each of them fitter than the other one because its neck is longer, the other because its neck is shorter? And talking of sheep, what about their horns? According to the classical school, they started growing freakishly, and then as they proved an asset in the sheep's struggle for life, nature went on selecting the horned animals and eliminating the hornless ones. But did it really? There are at least as many hornless sheep as those with horns. Which of them are fitter? Out of 120,000 fertilized eggs of the green frog, only 2 individuals survived. Are we to conclude that these 2 frogs out of 120,000 were selected by nature because they were the fittest ones, or rather that natural selection is nothing but blind mortality, which selects nothing at all? Okay, very interesting. Okay, so they're asking that question about the giraffe and the sheep again. And my answer is the same. Yes, you idiots. They can live side by side because they don't compete for the same food source.
Because grass doesn't grow on trees.
I don't even know how to how do you convey to someone that like a giraffe and a sheep don't compete for the same food source if it's not immediately obvious? It's kind of like saying, how does an elephant and a sparrow exist in the same environment? Like, what are you talking about?
Mm-hmm.
What? Huh? I mean, if you even have to ask the question, like, what are we doing here? You may be too far gone. If you're an adult, I'm sorry. If you're an adult asking that question, you may be too far gone. This is ridiculous. Like, these organisms, just watch them. Watch what they do. They will not eat the same food. And if they're not eating the same food, they have different niches. So that's the point.
And they're not competing.
Right, and they're not competing. Exactly. Yeah. Then that's the point of natural selection, is you're differentiating so that you can avoid competition with other populations. So the thing about this, the giraffe's neck is long. First of all, I don't even think they're like any sheep. I don't know about like sheep biogeography off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure there are no sheep in like the African savannah. I'm pretty sure. Pretty sure about that. So, first of all, so the giraffe's environment is such that having a long neck is beneficial for it. It lives in an environment in which there are lots and lots of grazing animals. There are like gazelle and wildebeest and elephants and rhinos. There are all these different animals which graze. So the ancestors of the giraffe found themselves in an environment in which having a neck that allowed it to eat from trees, to be a browser rather than a grazer, was beneficial. Actually, I take it back. Rhinoceroses are browsers rather than grazers, sorry. But the point still remains. There are many, many African mammals which are grazers. They all eat grass. Elephants, gazelle, all these wildebeest, all these guys, water buffalo. And so maybe the niche, the market on grass had been cornered already. And so for the ancestors of giraffes, rather than competing with all these other animals who are eating the same food source, maybe it was easier and they would survive. And those whose necks were slightly longer, allowing them to browse from trees, were simply, on average, more likely to survive and reproduce. And as a result, their necks got longer. Now, that may not be the whole explanation. As I pointed out earlier, sexual selection could also be part of it. Perhaps female giraffes, or female ancestral giraffes, chose males who had necks that were slightly longer, because maybe having a slightly longer neck meant that you could shoulder the burden of growing this, longer neck and longer legs, and you would still survive to reproductive age. So that's actually that's an idea in biology called Zahavi's principle. Or that's one of the ideas, one of the names for it. Basically, or the handicap principle is another. So like the peacock's tail is like a handicap. It's heavy, it's really big, it's hard to carry it around. But by having it until you become a full-grown adult male, that proves that you are fit enough to carry it around, which is attractive to females. So the females see that and they go, aha, he can outrun predators. His immune system must be good enough to ward off parasites, etc. So I'm going to mate with him. So perhaps that also played a role. It's entirely possible. I'm not sure. I don't know the specifics of giraffe evolution. The other thing is, so like I said, they're obviously not competing for the same food source. The other thing is, giraffes and sheep are cousins, but they're separated by, like, I'm pretty sure a couple tens of millions of years at the very least.
Mm-hmm.
Probably, like 30 or 40 million years from as a common ancestor. They're not that close, right? They're artiodactyls, they're even hoof mammals, but they're not that close, right? So, I mean, I'm not entirely sure what it's arguing there. The other thing was, it said some sheep have horns and some don't. Well, yes, or some male, I guess. Some male sheep have horns and some don't. Again, that probably relates to sexual selection. For some species, the females pick males who have horns, and for some they don't. And
I have to bite my tongue.
The reason is,
I have to bite my tongue now. Saying that the
Go ahead.
The horniest sheep are most likely to have offspring. Just saying.
Whatever works, right? Whatever works.
Yeah.
But the thing is, but that's the thing, right? Is sexual selection is arbitrary. What we consider indicators of vitality is not what the next species considers an indicator of vitality. It's arbitrary. And so the peahen, sees the male, the peacock, and for her, okay, having a large train, large tail, is an indicator of vitality, but that's not the case for the green peacock.
Not even in
Green
humans.
peafowl, sorry.
Not even in humans. If you go look at art, for instance, and especially when it comes to nude art, you can see over time different body shapes being the ones
Right.
that are thought of as aesthetically pleasing, and that is shifting over time.
Right.
So it's not just in animals where it's not always going to be the exact same thing. It's going to be shifting over time in a species because we can see that in our own. It has nothing to do with evolution, but it's a nice comparison to see how even in our species, sexual selection had its preferences and how those preferences were different in different times. If you go back, for instance, to I think it was the Middle Ages, where it was people with a really, really white skin, people who spent all of their time indoors, were seen as the most beautiful people because the working class had to spend their time outdoors, so they would get a tan.
Right.
It happens in every species, even in our own.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the thing about natural selection, as I hope Peter and I have pointed out at this point, is it's environment specific.
Mm-hmm.
It's natural selection is not a all or nothing thing. It's not an everywhere all the time thing. Natural selection is limited to your specific environment. It is your particular environmental pressures acting on your particular set of variations. It's very, very context specific. So the reason the polar bear has, white fur, whereas the African elephant has, very little fur.
It hasn't. The polar bear doesn't have white fur.
Or pigmentless fur.
Pigmentless.
Whatever.
Yes, it's not white.
Pigmentless fur. The reason it looks white.
It looks white.
I should say.
It's something that I picked up quite recently, and I'm really fond of that specific snippet that it's not white.
Right. It's not white. It's pigmentless.
You can annoy people with it.
The polar bear has this. The reason that it looks white is its environment is white. Mm-hmm. By contrast, the elephant has very little hair because its environment is very hot and it's directly impacted by the sun. And if it had a lot of hair, it would overheat. And so it's got a lot of mechanisms for cooling itself down, like large ears, and it bathes in mud and all these sorts of things. But the elephant is adapting to its environment. It's not adapting to the polar bear's environment up in the Arctic, up in the Arctic of Canada. It's adapting to its environment in the African savanna. And the same is true of the polar bear. It's not adapting to the African savanna. It's adapting to the polar Arctic. So natural selection is always about your particular circumstances. So finally, and so I really think they're not getting that. Like whoever wrote this really didn't understand that concept, is what I'm gathering.
And the root to that is everything has a common designer. So what works for something in polar circles should work for something in Africa because it has the same designer. This is probably why they won't get this. And
right. On Wrangel Island, an elephant adapted to a polar bear environment. You are correct, Hive Science. That is in fact the case. There were mammoths who were adapting to polar bear environments. So you got me there.
Isn't there also a famous island where we had dwarf elephants because they didn't need to be that big anymore? So they
well, yeah. I mean, there were lots of islands with dwarf elephants. A lot of them were in the Mediterranean. There were some off the coast of California. There were some north of Siberia. That was Wrangel Island was way up there. Oh, and the last thing on this section before we move to the next one was out of 120,000 fertilized eggs, only 2 individuals survive. Yeah, that's literally natural selection. That's differential survival and reproduction. So yeah. I mean, does blind mortality happen? Sure. I mean, individuals can get crushed by like landslides and meteors and stuff, but that's not what's happening here. Like most tadpoles are, if you lay 120,000 of them, you have a very large selection of like alleles, right, of different variations, and some of those are going to be beneficial, and the ones who have beneficial alleles are going to survive, and the ones who don't. It's that easy. And you can test that in real time. And we discussed this on the last episode with bacteria. You can take populations and adapt them to higher and higher orders of magnitude of like antibiotics. And you can see, okay, they're doing fine. Then there's a bottleneck and only this one line makes it through to the next area. And then they do fine again. Then there's a bottleneck and then, so on and so forth. And that's natural selection. Only the individuals who have those variations which allow them to survive in those environments are the ones which do survive. Not that hard.
Mm-hmm.
Not in my opinion, anyways. But I could be wrong, I guess. Apparently, it's very hard for this guy to grasp. Oh, look, we're almost done. Okay. Another example of the attack being leveled against the modern theory is that made by the prominent evolutionist John Rostand. Remember, he's world-renowned. John Rostand. Probably should be Jean Rostand. In his 1961 publication, The Orion Book of Evolution, Rostand says, quote, "It is really certain then, as the neo-Darwinists maintain, that the problem of evolution is a settled matter. I personally do not think so, and along with a good many others, I must insist on raising some banal objections to the doctrine of neo-Darwinism. The mutations which we know and which are considered responsible for the creation of the living world are, in general, either organic deprivations, deficiencies, loss of pigment, loss of appendage, or the doubling of the pre-existing organs. In any case, they never produce anything really new or original in the organic scheme, nothing which one might consider the basis for a new organ or the priming for a new function. No, decidedly, I cannot make myself think that these slips of heredity have been able, even with the cooperation of natural selection, even with the advantage of the immense periods of time in which evolution works on life, to build the entire world with its structural prodigality and refinements, its astounding adaptations. I cannot persuade myself to think that the eye, the ear, the human brain have been formed in this way. I discern nothing that gives me the right to conceive the profound structural alterations, the fantastic metamorphoses that we have to imagine in evolutionary history when we think of the transition from invertebrates to vertebrates, from fish to batrachians, from batrachians to reptiles, from reptiles to mammals," close quote. Okay, so it sounds like this Rostand guy is a creationist. Maybe that's why I never heard of him.
Mm-hmm.
But regardless, so he says the mutations which we know, which are considered responsible for the creation of the living world, are either organic deprivations, deficiencies, or the doubling of pre-existing organs. I don't know what he means by that. I mean, those things happen.
Yeah, I think it's pointing out again that there are no beneficial mutations.
Right.
Which is one of the things that keeps coming up. Even though you can show people beneficial mutations and they will say, but they're not in the textbooks. Right. Yeah, you probably picked out a middle school textbook where it's not mentioned. Great. Good for you.
Right. I mean, do losses happen? Sure, they happen, but I really don't think anybody is suggesting that's the only way mutations happen. Good gracious.
No. And then sometimes a loss
They
is
never
a
produced.
benefit. As I mentioned earlier,
Right, right. I think
if
you
you
talked about
have
that last
if
time.
you
Yeah.
have fish living in a cave and they have an eye that they could damage, losing that eye or having skin growing over it is beneficial. It's
Right. Exactly.
it's not a loss. It is gaining another thing, which is the beneficial structure that is coming over the eye in order to protect it. So it's a gain.
Right. And I mean, in fairness, um, the fish, the blind cave fish you're referring to, the Mexican cave tetra, it also enhanced its other senses as a result of
Mm-hmm.
losing its sight, so it can like smell and taste things better as a result. So it's not really a loss, it's not a total loss, anyways. Um, when he says they never produce anything really new or original, well, yeah. Um, now that we have Evo Devo, it's really the it really is very clear that novelties aren't truly novel. They're always things built upon other things, right? Like nothing just poofs out of nowhere like magic. That's what the creationists believe. The human hand, for instance, is descended ultimately from the fish fin, from the pectoral fins, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so the pectoral fins, though, I mean, you didn't like lose the fins and then arms evolved later, right? No, the
No.
fins evolved into limbs. You had a changing of the Hox genes that are involved in the development of the fin, leading ultimately to the limb, right? The bones that we have are the same bones that like lots of lobe-finned fish have, like Eusthenopteron, Panderichthes. They had the same arm bones we do,
Yep.
and so it's really dishonest and disingenuous to say, "Oh, well, nothing really new happens." Uh, well, what do you mean by new? Like the limb was new. It became new. It became a load-bearing structure, which the fin originally was not. The fin wasn't a load-bearing structure. So I don't know.
And
That seems like a very disingenuous.
and this is the funny thing within evolution. It can only work with what is there. So if you
Right.
have those bones in the lobe fin fish, and the fish develops the ability to go on land, yes, it will keep those bones because that's what it has. If
Mm-hmm.
another type would have gone onto land, we may have seen different structures. But this is how evolution worked. This particular species made it onto land, developed stronger and stronger legs uh, from their original fins, and so this is what is carried on in the species on land, and you will see the same bone structure in the species that came from it. It's really that easy.
Right.
If, on the other hand,
Oh,
we would have
and
a creator, why would he put the exact same bones everywhere in fish, in dolphins, in whales, where they don't need hands, they don't need fingers? Why does the manatee have fingernails? Stupid designer, right? I mean,
right.
this is completely explained through evolution. Whereas if you argue for a common designer, yeah, then he's either lazy or stupid, or both.
Right. Andrew Cumming pointed out the exact thing. I just checked the comments, and we were talking about the exact thing he posted in there. So yeah, you know what they say: great minds think alike.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he says, I cannot persuade myself to think that the eye, the ear, and the human brain have been formed this way. Well, we talked about the eye already. The ear, we actually have a fantastic fossil record of how the inner ear formed. That's RJ's purview. He even wrote an entire book on it, how the inner ear formed. Because for mammals, the ancestral like tetrapod um, ears, you basically have this one inner ear bone, And then for us, and your other bones are in the jaw. But in the line to mammals, those other bones migrated up to become the other bones of the inner ear. So we use them for hearing now. And we actually have every single step of that process in the fossil record. Every single step. It's totally unbroken line. It's a virtually perfect fossil record for the evolution of the inner ear for mammals. So to say, I can't persuade myself to think this happened. Yeah, sorry. We don't have to persuade ourselves. We have the fossils. It's over. I can't even imagine. Oh, and the same is true of the brain. But like even at that point, back in the 60s, comparative morphology was a thing, right? Like the you could look at the other primates, right? And say, look, they have all the same brain parts we have. Ours is just bigger proportionally than theirs is. We didn't add any new parts. It's just bigger. We have, we devote more developmental time to our brain and our neurons. And so I don't even understand that argument. It doesn't make any sense to me. But again, now we have, what were we saying?
Yeah, the weird thing is that morphology isn't a thing until you get people like Kent Hovind coming up with these slides that even a 5-year-old can answer.
Right.
3 animals with a slightly different morphology and 1 complete outlier. So this is where morphology is actually pointing the 5-year-old to what the same kind is. So in this thing, if they want it to be relevant, then it's relevant. If it is used in the fossil record, it can't be relevant, so it's discarded. That's the dishonesty of creationists.
Yeah. And he says the fantastic metamorphoses that we have to imagine in evolutionary history. Again, no, we don't. We don't have to imagine how invertebrates became vertebrates. We have Hycuella and Hycuichthyes and Mylacomyngia, all these early vertebrates who still are not quite vertebrates yet, but they're most of the way there. Fish to batrachians. Batrachians he's just using as a stand-in for amphibians, for anyone who's wondering. We have Osteolepiformes, we have Eusthenopteron, Panderichthyes, Tiktaalik, Alpistostega, Acanthostega, Ichthyostega, Tularpaton. We have loads and loads of fossils traversing that gap, from batrachians to reptiles. We have Gephyrostegis, we have the Simoriomorphs, we have Eucritta, from reptiles to mammals. Oh, good lord, we have hundreds of fossils for that. We got like the Pelycosaurs, Gorgonoptions, Anomodonts, and the Therocephalians and Cynodonts and Dicynodonts. There are so many fossil groups for each of these. It's ludicrous to just be like, nope, I can't imagine it. Didn't happen. Even in his time, even in the 60s, we knew about a number of those fossils that I just mentioned. It's not like all of those were discovered recently. Like some of those were known back then. So even then, I think he was kind of yanking the chain. Anyways.
But the weird thing is that these arguments are still used today. So you can argue that some of the things might not have been as well known back in the 60s. But these aren't arguments that are only used in the 60s. These are arguments that are used in 2022. People should actually start reading up on science a little bit, instead of just sticking to what was put in this book. Maybe not necessarily all thought up by the author, because he probably got it somewhere else anyway. But yeah, stop using those arguments.
I mean, yeah, and like you said, some of this stuff I can let some of it slide, because like we said, all of these fossils weren't known back then, but some of them were. And even then, evolution was overwhelmingly considered to be true by biologists. So even still, I'm sorry. I don't agree with this guy. After rejecting or questioning all the major theories, Roston asks, quote, will the future surprise us with a great new idea about the mechanism of evolution? We should certainly not exclude this hope, but it is difficult to restrain a certain skepticism, close quote. But then he concludes, quote, despite this rather disillusioned conclusion, it is of paramount importance that no excuse be found to cast doubt upon the fact of evolution itself. Close quote. But the honest investigator will do just that after several centuries of conflicting theories, arguments, and assertions. It must be obvious to the unprejudiced inquirer that evolution is not a fact at all, but is pure theory, and that it must be challenged to arrive at the truth.
He's right about one thing: it's pure theory, scientific theory, but
it is a theory.
Yeah. And also, it's funny.
It is very proudly a theory.
Yeah, it's funny that in 1967, he said there might be new mechanisms coming up. Yeah. Genetics, which pretty much nailed everything shut for evolution.
I mean, yeah, the like endosymbiosis was after this, neutral theory, evolutionary and developmental biology, punctuated equilibrium. These are all things that came later after this book was written. So yeah, there were more mechanisms to be found. I guess this is the last, then we'll be done. Quote, there is another aspect of the matter that needs to be considered. It was noted in a December 3rd, 1966 Saturday Evening Post article supporting evolution. Quote, among evolutionists leading the current research, feelings often run high when it comes to interpreting evidence. Criticism is sometimes regarded and perhaps even intended, and perhaps intended as a deep personal insult. Not long ago, a professor wrote an article questioning a former teacher in the mildest possible terms about the authenticity of a certain find and ended a friendship of 30 years. On another occasion, an eminent anthropologist arose to speak at a meeting given in his honor and began reminiscing about the early days of his career, where his ideas concerning human evolution had been ignored, but he managed to complete only a few sentences of his talk. Then, overcome by the recollection of years of frustration, he lowered his head and burst into tears. Investigators have stalked out of meetings, indulged in personal vituperation, argued over priorities, accused colleagues of stealing their ideas. Such behavior has been strikingly high among prehistorians. The reason for this occupational ailment is obscure, but it may have something to do with the shortage of solid evidence, sometimes the less excavators have to go on, the more ardently they stick to their guns, close quote. In trying to account for such peculiar, even juvenile behavior on the part of evolutionary scientists, the article adds, quote, I can't account for it, says an anthropologist who has been in the thick of a number of fights, but there is something about exploring the past that affects you. It seems that every time a man finds a human bone, he goes crazy on the spot, close quote. All of this is positive evidence that the truly scientific method has not and is not being applied to the theories of evolution. The facts have not forced conclusions, but the preconceived conclusions of evolutionists have forced the facts. The method correctly called scientific is that which analyzes all the facts available first and then draws conclusions. This the unprejudiced investigator can do, for many proved science facts are at his disposal. These will allow each one to judge for himself on the basis of solid evidence alone and to draw honest conclusions that are not based on ego, petty differences, a search for glory and advancement, or on preconceived notions. From such facts, what conclusion can be drawn regarding the origin of life? Okay, so that whole section, he just kind of sounded like he was whining, basically. I didn't really hear a single argument in there.
No.
He just said some biologists and paleontologists have petty egos, which, okay.
Yeah.
You ever heard of Ken Ham? No, well, you probably hadn't at this point, but
no.
But I say to the book. But there, you want to talk about petty egos? Answers in Genesis became a thing because its parent company split. It got divorced in large part because of Ken Ham. So, I mean, this is the pot calling the kettle black. If I'm being honest.
Yeah. Answers in Genesis used to have a page on Kent Hovind, for instance,
Right.
pretty much saying how you shouldn't believe anything that comes out of his mouth. They have removed it, but yeah, when it comes to egos, we do see that in religion as well. Can you remind me how many denominations we have right now because of people who didn't get along with the people that they...
Right.
I mean, this is just a human thing, and people get passionate
Right.
about their work. So yes, I can actually
Right.
see that. It isn't just ego. It's being passionate about what maybe is your life's work. And you could end up
Sure.
talking to one of your students who's going to prove you wrong. And yeah, that might end a friendship. Doesn't matter. If the student is correct in this case, then the student is correct. And then, sorry if that ends a
Right.
friendship. It happens. We're human. We're passionate about the things that we do. The things that I was almost going to say the things that we believe in. We believe in the things that we want to do. Not necessarily a religious belief, but the things we think are important to do.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And
No, I agree.
so it's
I think he was just kind of like poisoning the well, basically. Just saying, oh, you can't really trust these evolutionists because sometimes they get into disagreements with each other and it's based on egos. Like, get a grip. That's not an argument. Come on.
You don't see that at all among creationists. Wait.
Nope. Never. Never, ever. Anyway, so that's the end of this chapter. Well, somehow I was a little disappointed, Peter. I thought there were going to be more facts in there, but there weren't.
I'm disappointed to see that literally everything that we have gone through so far is still being used. If anything, that to me is disappointing. Yeah. What we're talking about people who claim to be creation scientists, who still come up with the exact same claims that are made in this book, the exact same refutations of evolutionary biology that are mentioned in this book. There's nothing new. Mm-hmm. What are these scientists working on? That's what I want to know.
Right.
How come there are no new arguments coming up?
I know, right? Like, what's the deal, guys? Come on, you gotta... one thing, please, we beg you. In like 60 years, please come up with one thing. Please.
Yeah. Come up with a list of originally created animals. Come up with a list of animals that made it onto the ark. That's not... If there's evidence for it, as you say, then it should be easy to find. You should find a bottleneck, and then after that bottleneck, those were the kinds that were there. So find them. Please point them out. Go back 6,000 years and point out which were the originally created kinds from which... Oh, it didn't evolve, did it? No. I mean, evolution can't happen, but we can have a boat which has a limited capacity of taking on animals. And 99.9%...
It's not evolution, it's variation.
Yeah. And 99.9% of that variation has died out. Makes you wonder.
Yeah.
If it died out during the flood, that means that we had super evolution before, or God created an immense amount of creatures. And then when he said take one of every kind, he didn't mean every kind. He meant a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of kinds that he thought were necessary to bring on the ark. And then we got hyper turbo evolution again. It just doesn't work.
What? What are you talking about?
The sad part is that to a small group of people, a very small group, although they are the growing group, whereas the overall religious people are on the decline. But a small group thinks that this part of science is so damaging to their beliefs that they have to constantly lie and come up with all kinds of misinformation, quote mines, in order to further their case. And that is the part that I don't get.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can't tell me that these people by now don't realize that that is what they're doing. We've been pointing out Darwin's I quote for decades now. They should know it's a quote mine. They should know that there's more after that particular quote. You can't just say, well, I'm justified in using that quote because I didn't know. I'm not buying that anymore.
Yeah. I do love that, like, every time they throw an argument at you, and it's one you've heard inevitably 1,000 times before, but they act like this is the first time you've heard of it. Like, they bring it to you and they're like, have you ever heard of Romans 1:18? Like, no, I haven't. Please tell me. I'd love to know. Dear God. Like, every time, or they tell you, like, have you ever heard of polystrate fossils? I bet you've never heard of polystrate fossils before. I bet you've never heard of the Darwin I quote. Like, Jesus, please, just end it. Come up with a new argument. Good Lord.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right. Well, we're past the 2-hour mark. So Peter, thank you again for co-hosting and producing.
You're welcome.
And thank you everybody who showed up and watched. Really appreciate everybody. Have you read Simon Conway Morris? Yeah, he's a paleontologist. Thank you everyone for coming, and we will see you all next Thursday. It'll be at 7 p.m. Central Time.
Slightly earlier.
Our normal time.
So I can sleep.
Yeah, slightly earlier. I had work ran a little bit late today, but it should be fine next week. So we'll see you guys next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.